Imagine being surrounded on all sides by an enemy that outnumbers you 4-1. Gunfire rips through the tall grass. The air is thick with smoke and the screams of wounded men. In the midst of this chaos, a radio crackles with a desperate code word. Broken arrow. This one call means an American unit is on the verge of being overrun, and every available aircraft is going to swoop in to unleash hell, even if it's right on top of the embattled soldier's own position. In November 1965, in a remote valley of Vietnam, one U.S. battalion lived through this nightmare and survived by the slimmest of margins. This is the harrowing story of the Battle of Ia Drang, where a trapped and outnumbered battalion called in airstrikes on itself to avoid annihilation. The Vietnam War was escalating in 1965, and the U.S. Army's new 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile, was testing a radical tactic, using helicopters to zip combat troops across jungles and mountains. This strategy would be put to a deadly trial in the Ia Drang Valley, a remote area in Vietnam's central highlands near the Cambodian border. In mid-November, American intelligence tracked large formations of the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, in this valley. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Hal Moore, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, around 450 men, was ordered to fly in and find the enemy. Moore was a seasoned leader. He knew the history of his unit, the 7th Cavalry, which had once been led to disaster by General Custer at Little Bighorn. This time, Moore vowed, there would be no such last stand if he could help it. Capture 1. Day 1. Landing Zone X-ray into the Valley of Death. On the morning of November 14th, 1965, Moore's battalion arrived by UH-1 Huey helicopters at a clearing codenamed Landing Zone X-ray at the foot of the Chupong Massif, a jagged jungle-covered mountain. Soldiers leapt from choppers into waist-high elephant grass, not knowing thousands of enemy troops were hidden in the nearby woods. At first, only eerie silence and heat greeted them. The temperature would soar to 100 degrees Fahrenheit under the tropical sun. The plan was to secure the clearing and then move out to hunt the enemy. Many of these American troopers were fresh to combat, average age just 19 or 20, but well-trained and eager. They moved out cautiously from the LZ, eyes scanning the tree line for any movement. Within an hour of landing, contact with the enemy came suddenly and ferociously. A patrol from Captain Tony Nadal's Bravo Company captured a lone North Vietnamese scout, but almost immediately the jungle erupted with gunfire. Just past noon, waves of North Vietnamese soldiers from the 33rd Regiment came pouring through the trees in a massive assault. They had been lying in wait, and now they struck hard. Bullets whizzed past the Americans, and mortar shells began thumping into the ground. The 1st 7 Cavalry was effectively ambushed. They had walked right into an enemy stronghold and now found themselves vastly outnumbered. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore quickly got on his radio and called for artillery support from batteries miles away. Explosions began to erupt beyond the perimeter as American artillery tried to keep the attackers at bay. Meanwhile, Moore's companies formed a defensive perimeter around LZ X-ray. Platoons dug in behind termite mounds and clumps of trees, using the sparse cover available. The fighting was intense and chaotic. Platoons were sometimes isolated or out of communication in the thick brush. On one flank, a terrible situation was unfolding. One platoon from Bravo Company, led by 2nd Lieutenant Henry Herrick, had chased some enemy scouts too far. Herrick's 2nd platoon suddenly found itself cut off from the rest of the force, swallowed by the jungle. About 29 Americans were now isolated on a knoll, surrounded by scores of North Vietnamese. Herrick's platoon fought desperately as swarming enemies closed in. Within minutes, Lieutenant Herrick was mortally wounded, along with several other key men. Under a hail of fire, Sergeant Ernie Savage assumed command of the battered platoon. Savage got on the radio and calmly reported they were surrounded and in need of help. Moore's heart sank as he listened to the lost platoon transmit their situation. They were only a few hundred yards away, but might as well have been on another planet, for all he could do immediately. Moore vowed to rescue them, but his own perimeter was under heavy attack and he couldn't spare the men yet. All through that afternoon, the lost platoon fought on alone. They crouched in shallow depressions, returning fire at hordes of enemy soldiers only tens of meters away. Artillery shells called in by Moore's men pounded around their position to keep the NVA from overrunning them. Sergeant Savage directed strikes by radio, calling in danger-close artillery that shook the ground and tore apart trees around the platoon's tiny defensive ring. The isolated men heard the shouts and bugles of NVA troops all around, but they held their fire until enemy figures were nearly on top of them, then unleashed rifles and grenades. In those first hours, Savage's men beat back multiple assaults, inflicting heavy losses. Out of 29 men, casualties mounted. By nightfall, nearly half were dead or wounded, but the platoon was still holding on by sheer grit. Back at LZ X-Ray, the situation on day one was grim but under control. The rest of Moore's companies, around 350 men after Herrick's platoon was cut off, established a horseshoe-shaped perimeter. The battle raged through the afternoon of November 14th. North Vietnamese troops kept charging out of the trees in frightening numbers. They were brave and determined, pressing so close that in some spots the fighting was hand-to-hand. American M60 machine guns poured streams of bullets into the onrushing NVA ranks. One American machine gunner, Specialist Willard Parrish, performed astonishing feats that day and the next. At one point he fired his M60 until it was out of ammo, then grabbed his .45 pistol and kept shooting. By the end of the battle, over 100 enemy dead were found piled in front of Parrish's position alone. Such was the ferocity of the attacks he single-handedly helped repel. Amid the chaos, American air support was already making a difference. Not long after first contact, Moore had radioed for close air support and helicopter gunships. Soon, U.S. Air Force jets screamed over the canopy, dropping bombs and napalm on enemy positions along the edge of the clearing. The earth shuddered with each thundering blast, and gouts of flame and black smoke rose from the tree lines. The North Vietnamese were trying to grab the Americans by the belt, a tactic their commander, Colonel Nguyen Hu An, urged, meaning to get in so close to U.S. troops that the Americans couldn't safely use heavy fire support. But even with the NVA hugging the U.S. lines, airstrikes and artillery were still punishing them. Dozens of NVA fell in each assault, though more kept coming. One North Vietnamese fighter would later recall the horror of enduring the relentless American bombardment, saying they used bayonet charges and human wave tactics to try to overwhelm the U.S. lines, taking terrible losses in the process. Yet, fueled by ideology and anger, the survivors pressed on again and again. The Americans were fighting for their lives and for each other. Young soldiers who just days before were fresh out of training were now calling on every ounce of courage. Men like Captain Bob Edwards, commanding Charlie Company, found themselves in the fight of their lives. Edwards was hit by shrapnel early on, wounding him, but he refused to leave his men. He stayed on the line, directing Charlie Company's fire even as blood soaked through his sleeve. Nearby, the battalion's tough-as-nails Sergeant Major, Basil Plumley, a veteran of World War II and Korea, strode calmly through flying bullets to deliver ammunition and words of encouragement. When frightened soldiers asked how they would survive, Plumley's steely presence and gravelly voice steadied them. He had seen worse, and he wasn't about to let his boys give up. One of the most critical lifelines that day came from the sky in the form of Huey helicopters. Major Bruce "Snake" Ladd Crandall, the lead pilot of the division's helicopter company, performed unbelievable heroics. He and his wingman, Captain Ed Freeman, flew their unarmed Hueys again and again into LZ X-Ray, braving intense enemy fire. At one point, Crandall's chopper took several hits, and soldiers loading wounded men aboard were killed mid-action. Yet Crandall kept his helicopter on the ground under fire until every wounded trooper they could reach was aboard. Trip after trip, these pilots delivered crates of ammunition, water, and medical supplies to the besieged infantry, then lifted out the worst of the wounded. They flew low and slow into the hot landing zone, easy targets for enemy gunners, but neither man wavered. Over the course of the day, Crandall flew 22 missions into X-ray, virtually unheard of. His helicopters were shot full of holes, and he even switched to fresh aircraft as some became too damaged. Thanks to these brave pilots, critically wounded men got a chance at life, and the frontline troops never ran out of ammo. By nightfall on November 14th, Crandall and Freeman had evacuated some 70 wounded GIs and undoubtedly saved many lives. Years later, both men would receive the Medal of Honor for their valor that day. As darkness fell on LZ X-ray the first night, the battlefield fell eerily quiet. The Americans had endured wave after wave of attacks since midday, but they still held their ground. The clearing was pockmarked with craters and littered with shattered trees. The acrid smell of spent gunpowder and burning vegetation hung in the air. All around the perimeter, US soldiers hunkered down in shallow foxholes or behind piles of dirt they'd scraped up for cover. Some sipped from canteens, their throats raw and dry from a day of shouting and inhaling dust. Many whispered prayers or thoughts of loved ones back home, wondering if they'd see the sunrise. Lieutenant Colonel Moore walked the perimeter in the dark, speaking quietly to his company commanders and checking on the men. He knew the worst might be yet to come. He later recalled that he vowed not to leave any man behind, alive or dead. Moore made sure the lines were tight and ammunition was redistributed. At one foxhole, he found reporter Joseph "Joe" Galloway, a civilian journalist who had flown in with the troops to cover the battle. Galloway was supposed to be an observer, but in the day's fury he had taken up a rifle to help defend a wounded soldier. Moore told Galloway, "Glad you're with us," acknowledging that in this fight, everyone's courage mattered, soldier or civilian. Galloway would later receive a Bronze Star for helping save soldiers under fire that day. The night of November 14th to 15th was anything but peaceful. The North Vietnamese were still out there, in the jungle, preparing for more assaults. Around midnight, they tested the American lines with probing attacks. Flares fired by US mortar teams floated down under parachutes, casting ghostly white light over the tall grass. In that harsh glare, American sentries could sometimes see NVA troops crawling or creeping just yards away. Out of the darkness came sudden bursts of gunfire. At one point, a group of NVA sappers, combat engineers, tried to infiltrate the lines. They lobbed grenades and charged into a gap, screaming battle cries. A brutal spasm of close-quarters combat erupted. Rifles cracked at muzzle flash range. Silhouettes grappled and stabbed in the flickering light. The assault was beaten back, but it left American and NVA bodies entangled on the perimeter's edge. In the command post area, a North Vietnamese soldier suddenly burst out of the shadows, firing his AK-47. Sergeant Major Plumley drew his .45 pistol. The old veteran always carried a handgun, and shot the enemy soldier dead before he could wreak havoc. Such was the intensity of that long, dreadful night. By 4 a.m., most of the shooting died down. Both sides were exhausted. The Americans had managed to hold firm, but everyone knew at first light the battle would rage again. Through the night, Moore also kept an ear to the radio, listening for any sign of rescue for the lost platoon. Sergeant Savage and his remaining men were still pinned on that knoll a short distance away. They had spent a terrifying night fighting off NVA attackers in the darkness. Savage had skillfully called in artillery around his position until the line went quiet. The platoon was running low on water and ammo, and their wounded were suffering without medical aid. In the pre-dawn hours, they could only lie as silently as possible, hoping the enemy wouldn't notice just how few of them were left. Moore knew they were out there, and it haunted him. He planned to reach them as soon as he had enough reinforcements, or a break in the action at X-ray. Capture 2, Day 2. Dawn Assault and Broken Arrow. Dawn on November 15th, 1965, the second day, came with an uneasy calm. As pale light filtered through the haze, an eerie quiet settled over LZ X-ray. The jungle was still. Many American soldiers felt a surge of dread. The sudden silence after so much violence was ominous. Lieutenant Colonel Moore sensed something big was coming. He later noted it was too quiet. He ordered a few recon patrols to venture cautiously outward and probe for enemy forces. Everyone else was on full alert, weapons ready. Suddenly, at roughly 6:50 a.m., a pair of breathless scouts from one patrol came sprinting back through the brush towards the perimeter. "They're coming! Hundreds of them!" they shouted. Before they could even take cover, the edges of the clearing erupted in muzzle flashes and the thunder of a new, massive NVA attack. This was it. The North Vietnamese forces, reinforced overnight by fresh troops from the 66th Regiment, launched an all-out offensive to crush the Americans. Hundreds of enemy soldiers surged forward, firing rifles and machine guns, lobbing grenades as they advanced. They came from multiple directions, attempting to overwhelm the perimeter in at least two key spots. One major thrust aimed directly at the sector held by Charlie Company on the south side of the LZ. There, Captain Bob Edwards and his already battered company suddenly faced an onslaught from three sides. NVA troops in camouflaged uniforms, their pith helmets taped with leaves and branches, came charging through the grass with bayonets fixed. Charlie Company's men opened up with everything they had. M16 rifles crackled, M60 machine guns sent long bursts ripping through the ranks of attackers, and grenade launchers pumped out rounds that exploded amid the charging enemy. The sheer momentum of the NVA assault brought them right up against some American foxholes. Men fought at muzzle flash range. One American threw aside his empty rifle and swung his entrenching shovel at an enemy soldier clambering into his position. There was absolutely no quarter given on either side. It was kill or be killed. Within minutes, Charlie Company was in dire straits. Dozens of its men were down, wounded or killed, and the enemy kept pressing in. Captain Edwards, already wounded from the previous day, was shot again. This time seriously. Bleeding badly, he passed command to his executive officer before being pulled to a safer spot. On another part of the line, all the officers of one platoon fell, leaving a young sergeant to rally the defenders. Despite horrific losses, the men of Charlie Company refused to break. They knew if they gave up an inch, the enemy would pour through and the whole battalion could be rolled up. Meanwhile, Delta Company, holding another side of the perimeter, was also engaged in a life-or-death fight. Specialist Willard Parrish and other machine gunners with Delta raked the oncoming enemy with streams of bullets. Parrish's M60 barrel grew red-hot as he mowed down one wave after another, shell casings piling around him. The North Vietnamese piled up their own dead to use as sandbags, firing from behind the gruesome cover. Through the choking smoke and dust, American soldiers could often see the faces of the attackers. Some merely teenagers, eyes ablaze with fanatical resolve, charging even as comrades fell around them. As the situation grew increasingly desperate, Lieutenant Colonel Moore realized his men might not hold much longer without drastic measures. He grabbed the radio handset and called for his forward air controller, Air Force Lieutenant Charlie Hastings, who was orbiting above in a small Cessna spotter plane. Moore's voice was calm but urgent as he requested immediate air support right on the perimeter. Hastings had already been monitoring the fierce assault developing below. Now, seeing how close the enemy was to overrunning the Americans, Lieutenant Hastings made a fateful decision. He radioed the emergency code, Broken Arrow. Broken Arrow was a distress call, reserved for when a U.S. unit was on the brink of total defeat. It meant every available combat aircraft in South Vietnam, American or Allied, was to drop whatever mission they were on and race to help this endangered unit. It was a rare and dramatic call, essentially throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, to save a beleaguered force. Within minutes of Hastings's call, help was on the way. Above, in the dawn sky, pilots in dozens of aircraft heard the call and diverted toward Ia Drang. Soon the roar of jet engines filled the air. Over the battalion radio net, Moore ordered his men to mark the far edge of their defensive lines with colored smoke grenades. Popping and hissing, green and yellow smoke clouds billowed at the perimeter, signaling to the incoming pilots. Hit on the far side of this smoke, the enemy is just beyond. The soldiers prayed the pilots would aim true. The next hours brought an unprecedented barrage onto and around LZ X-ray. Air Force F-100 Super Sabres were the first to arrive overhead, screaming in low. They unloaded bombs and napalm canisters almost on top of the American positions. Each explosion was deafening. Great gouts of flame from napalm spread across the clearing's edge, incinerating foliage and enemy soldiers alike in a hellish flash. Some US troopers, lying flat in their foxholes, felt the searing heat on their faces and the concussive thump in their chests with each strike. The ground trembled continuously. Wave after wave of aircraft came in. Navy and Air Force fighters, even World War II-era propeller-driven A-1 Sky Raiders that could fly slower and hit more precisely. They dived in so close that shrapnel from their bombs pattered down among the Americans. One soldier remembered the sky being filled with circling planes, stacked at different altitudes, each waiting its turn to rain destruction on the enemy surrounding X-ray. The deluge of fire was a double-edged sword. It kept the North Vietnamese from massing for a final push, pinning and shredding many of them in the open. But it also meant dangerously close blasts near the Americans. Friendly artillery from nearby fire bases was also pouring shells outside the perimeter in coordination with the airstrikes. The battlefield was a cauldron of blast and flame, smoke and debris. Communication became difficult in the roar. Moore's men held their foxholes as dirt and shrapnel showered over them. In the confusion, the colored smoke markers became obscured by dust and ash. This was what the NVA had hoped for. With so much smoke, it was hard for pilots to tell exactly where the American lines were. Some NVA troops even tried to rush inside the American lines, essentially hugging them, to escape the bombardment and force US pilots to hold fire. During this mayhem, a terrifying incident occurred. Two F-100 jets made a run toward a target just beyond the American lines at about 8:30 a.m. Each carried 2 napalm canisters. Lieutenant Charlie Hastings, the air controller, saw that the jets were lined up incorrectly. They were approaching too far north, which put the Americans in danger. He frantically radioed for them to abort the run. The lead pilot either didn't hear the warning in time or couldn't pull up fast enough. He released his napalm canisters right as Hastings shouted for him to stop. Several men on the ground, including Lieutenant Colonel Moore, watched in horror as 2 metal tanks tumbled end over end through the air, directly toward their own lines. In an instant, the canisters hit with a whoomp, and a wall of fire erupted inside the American perimeter. A wave of blistering heat washed over the command post area. Soldiers screamed as liquid fire splashed. Moore himself was knocked flat by the blast's force, though unhurt. 2 of his men caught in that unfortunate strike were horribly burned. Others nearby were stunned or singed. Moore got back up and immediately yelled into the radio for Hastings to wave off the second jet. The second F-100 managed to pull up at the last moment, carrying its deadly load away. Medics rushed in to aid the burned soldiers. It was a sobering reminder. Calling in airstrikes this close was a gamble. They were dancing on a razor's edge between survival and self-destruction. Despite the friendly fire accident, Moore knew without the air support they'd be finished. So he radioed Hastings, "Keep it coming, just be careful." For the North Vietnamese, the bombardment was beyond devastating. Whole sections of jungle were being flattened and set ablaze. Yet, incredibly, some of the NVA kept attacking in smaller groups, many nearly suicidal in their determination. They probed for weak points even as bombs fell around them. In one section of the line, a few dozen NVA managed to get through a gap and charged straight at a command post bunker. They were met by a mix of soldiers from headquarters staff and any nearby unit. Cooks, clerks, even the journalist Joe Galloway grabbed an M16. They all fired point blank into the onrushing enemy, felling them just yards from the radios and wounded men that the NVA hoped to capture. The American defense held, but barely. After about 3 hours of continuous attack, the fury of the NVA offensive began to falter. Broken Arrow had done its job. The relentless air and artillery strikes, combined with the stubborn resistance of the US troopers, had halted the enemy assault just at the breaking point. By roughly 9 a.m. or 10 a.m., what had been a human wave now ebbed back into the shattered tree lines. Moore's men could hardly believe it. Many were deafened temporarily from the explosions, and everywhere they looked beyond their foxholes were the bodies of enemy soldiers, dozens upon dozens of them. Charred clearings and small fires smoldered where napalm had ignited brush. Charlie Company's sector, which had borne the worst of the assault, was a scene of heroism and heartbreak. Incredibly, Charlie Company still held its line, but at a terrible cost. Virtually every officer in the company was now dead or wounded. Young sergeants had stepped up to command the few uninjured men left. Out of around 100+ soldiers in Charlie Company at the start, only 49 men were still standing who hadn't been hit. Some squads were down to only 2 or 3 men, and yet they had not yielded. Their valor under impossible conditions had saved the entire battalion from being overrun. As the immediate danger subsided, Moore moved quickly to shore up his defenses and prepare for any renewal of the attack. But now, help was finally arriving on the ground. Through the cordite haze, additional American troops appeared, moving into X-ray on foot. These were men from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, led by Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade, and the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, under Lieutenant Colonel Walter Tully. These units had been ordered to march overland, or had been lifted by choppers nearby to reinforce Moore's beleaguered 1st Battalion. By late morning of November 15th, they began reaching X-ray. Captain Myron Diderick's Alpha Company of 2-7 Cavalry was among the first, taking up positions to reinforce the thinnest parts of Moore's perimeter. Not long after, elements of Tully's 2-5 Cavalry arrived after an arduous trek through enemy territory to get there. The sight of these fresh American troops was a huge relief. They brought extra firepower and allowed Moore to finally have enough strength to do what he had been aching to do since the previous day: rescue the lost platoon. Around midday on the 15th, with the enemy assaults clearly broken, Lieutenant Colonel Moore organized a combined rescue column. 2 rifle companies from the newly arrived 2/5th Cavalry were assigned to link up with Captain Nadal's Bravo Company of Moore's battalion, which was nearest to where the cut-off platoon was thought to be. Moore coordinated a plan. Artillery fire would prep the area with smoke and explosive rounds to keep any hiding NVA heads down, and helicopter gunships would rocket the flanks. Then the relief force would move out from X-ray towards the knoll where Sergeant Savage and his men had been hanging on. As the relief column departed, everyone at X-ray held their breath. The soldiers advanced cautiously, stepping over splintered logs and skirted craters. The tension was high. No one knew if the NVA might still be lurking to ambush the relief effort. The air was thick with dust and the pungent smell of explosives. American artillery fired a few timed salvos ahead of the column, the rounds whistling overhead and exploding farther out to deter any remaining enemy. Finally, after an agonizing approach, American troopers spotted haggard figures huddled on a small rise. It was the remnants of Sergeant Savage's platoon. A cheer went up as the relief force rushed to secure the area. What they found was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. The knoll was littered with expended shells, broken rifles, and the bodies of NVA soldiers mingled with those of Americans. Many of the lost platoon's men had miraculously survived by playing dead among the carnage. Sergeant Ernie Savage and his men were caked in dirt, exhausted to the bone, but alive. They had basically melded into the ground after enduring constant shelling and gunfire. One soldier's face was so coated with dust that his rescuers at first thought he was mortally injured, only for him to grin weakly when offered water. Only 7 men in that platoon were unhurt. They had started with 29. The rest were either dead or wounded. 9 lay lifeless and 13 wounded, some critically, were being tended. Savage had somehow kept his battered group together through over 24 hours of hell, directing air and artillery strikes by radio and repelling attacks until his radio went dead. The rescuers gently helped the wounded and collected the fallen. Some soldiers wept at the sight of their comrades so torn up, but they also exchanged firm handshakes and backslaps with the survivors. These few had stood their ground against impossible odds and lived. It was nothing short of a miracle to finally bring them back into friendly lines. Moore was relieved beyond words when word came over the radio. "We found them. They're coming in." By the afternoon of November 15th, LZ X-ray was secure. More American reinforcements were now concentrated there than ever. Essentially 3 battalions, Moore's 1-7 and parts of 2 others. The North Vietnamese, for their part, had finally had enough at X-ray. They had thrown everything at the landing zone for 2 days and nights and suffered horrific casualties under the American firepower. Small, sporadic skirmishes still flared up here and there as US troops patrolled outward. But no large, organized attacks came again at X-Ray. Many NVA survivors melted back toward the sanctuary of the Chupong Mountain, or across the border into Cambodia to regroup. Moore's men spent the rest of that day policing the battlefield, collecting enemy documents, counting bodies, and aiding their own wounded. One grim but telling scene was the discovery of an NVA regimental aid station not far from the LZ, overrun by the shifting tides of battle. There, American medics found makeshift stretchers and many enemy dead. It was a stark indicator of how badly the NVA had been mauled. On the other hand, the US casualties were sobering as well. Helicopters landed and took off throughout the day, evacuating American wounded and dead alike. Soldiers had to say goodbye to fallen friends, carefully carrying their bodies wrapped in ponchos to the landing zone for evacuation. The toll at X-Ray over 3 days of fighting was staggering for Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry. Out of about 450 men, 79 were killed, and 121 wounded. Nearly a quarter of the battalion had been lost. Entire platoons had been nearly wiped out. Charlie Company was down to half strength. Bravo Company had lost many, including Lieutenant Herrick's doomed platoon. Alpha and Delta companies had their share of heroes lost as well. Every survivor bore the weight of those losses, etched in haunted eyes and thousand-yard stares as they slumped down in exhaustion now that the adrenaline ebbed. Yet they had survived and held their ground. By the morning of November 16th, the 3rd day at X-Ray, the US had firm control of the clearing and its vicinity. No more major enemy engagements took place there. The Battle of LZ X-Ray was essentially over, and the Americans, though bloodied, had won a tactical victory. Commanding General Westmoreland, the US commander in Vietnam, and others would later hail Ia Drang as proof that American mobility and firepower could smash larger enemy formations. Indeed, estimates of NVA casualties were extremely high. By some counts, at least 600 to 800 North Vietnamese were killed at X-Ray, with total losses in the Ia Drang campaign running over 1,000. The US would even claim a 10-to-1 kill ratio in this fight. But those numbers masked a painful reality. Each American loss was deeply felt, and the North Vietnamese showed no sign of giving up despite their losses. Capture 3. Aftermath and legacy of Ia Drang. With the enemy seemingly gone from X-Ray, American commanders made a decision to pull out of the landing zone. There was reason to be cautious. B-52 strategic bombers were scheduled to carpet bomb the Chupong Massif, and Moore's men needed to be clear of the area to avoid friendly fire from those massive 750-pound bombs. On November 16th, after collecting their casualties and stabilizing the situation, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's 1st 7th Cavalry received orders to withdraw from landing zone X-Ray. They had done their job and earned some rest. Other units, the newly arrived 2-7 and 2-5 cavalry battalions, would remain to cover the area until the bombers did their work. In the afternoon, Moore's exhausted troopers were finally airlifted out, or marched out of that cursed clearing. Many soldiers took one last look around at the scorched earth, the shattered trees, and the still bodies of enemy soldiers lying where they fell, and felt a swirl of emotions: relief, sorrow, anger, pride. It all mixed together. They had been through a crucible of fire and survived. In 3 days at X-Ray, they had stared death in the face repeatedly. They had seen friends perform incredible acts of courage, like PFC Jack Gagan, who died while shielding a wounded comrade, or Lieutenant Walter Malm, who single-handedly assaulted an enemy machine gun bunker with grenades and was wounded knocking it out. Malm would also receive the Medal of Honor for his bravery. They had witnessed the very best of camaraderie and sacrifice. They also felt the searing pain of loss and the lingering terror of how close it had been. If not for the firepower summoned by that broken arrow call, if not for those jets and artillery and attack helicopters, they might all be dead. The story of Ia Drang didn't quite end at X-Ray, however. In fact, as Moore's men exited the valley, another tragedy was about to unfold. On November 17th, Lieutenant Colonel McDade's 2nd 7th Cavalry which had come to X-ray as reinforcement, was ordered to march to a new evacuation point called LZ Albany, about 4 miles away. As McDade's 500-man column snaked through the jungle toward Albany, they walked into a devastating ambush by fresh NVA forces. In that ambush at LZ Albany, the tables were turned. The Americans were caught scattered in the open and attacked at extremely close range, where air power and artillery couldn't safely help them. It was a nightmare brawl. By the time it was over, McDade's battalion suffered over 150 killed and many more wounded, one of the worst single battle losses of the Vietnam War for the US forces. The North Vietnamese had struck back hard. So, in the broader Ia Drang campaign, both sides could claim a form of victory. The United States could point to LZ X-ray and say, "We went toe-to-toe with the enemy's best troops and, thanks to our training, guts, and massive fire support, we beat them, holding the ground and inflicting enormous casualties." The North Vietnamese, however, could look at LZ Albany and the overall toll on US forces and say, "We too dealt the Americans a grievous blow, and learned that if we fight close and ambush well, we can negate their technological advantage." In fact, one of North Vietnam's legendary generals, Vo Nguyen Giap, studied Ia Drang and concluded that America might win battles, but if the cost was high enough each time, eventually America would tire and leave. In that sense, Ia Drang foreshadowed the long and painful war to come. For the American public, Ia Drang was one of the first major stories of the war. It got considerable attention in late 1965 as news of the battle's ferocity and US casualties trickled out. Back home at Fort Benning, Georgia, the families of the 7th Cavalry waited anxiously. In a heart-wrenching turn, the Army at that time delivered death telegrams by taxicab. Julia Moore, Hal Moore's wife, upon hearing of heavy losses in her husband's unit, took it upon herself to comfort and support the newly widowed wives in person, even before the Army had a system to do so. The sight of military taxis in the neighborhood became a source of dread. Mrs. Moore and some other officers' wives personally delivered terrible news to several families. A compassionate gesture that later prompted the Army to change its notification process to be more humane. They began sending uniformed officers and chaplains to inform next of kin, rather than just a telegram. For those who survived Ia Drang, the battle forged unbreakable bonds. Men who had been strangers in the training camps now called each other brother. They had saved one another's lives countless times over those days. They had also, in the heat of battle, committed acts of valor that will forever be remembered in American military history. The code, Broken Arrow, has since entered legend, a symbol of last resort, of courage under fire, and of sacrifice. It was rarely invoked, but at Ia Drang it undoubtedly saved an American battalion from being wiped out. Looking back, the Battle of Ia Drang was truly a pivotal moment. It was the first major showdown between US forces and regular North Vietnamese troops. It proved that helicopter air mobility could put American troops smack in the enemy's face faster than ever. But it also showed the danger of being so far in hostile territory with little initial support. It underscored the importance of air power in modern war. Those young US cavalrymen learned that despite all their technology, victory still depended on the bravery and determination of the individual soldier on the ground. They fought tooth and nail against a seasoned enemy on that foreign field, and in those critical hours when all seemed nearly lost, they did not break. Hal Moore would later co-author a best-selling book about Ia Drang, titled We Were Soldiers Once and Young, with reporter Joe Galloway immortalizing the story. In the years to come, Moore often reflected on the battle's legacy. He was proud of his men's performance, but also deeply mindful of the cost. He famously met with his former North Vietnamese adversaries decades later, sharing condolences and respect, both sides recognizing the extraordinary bravery of the other. The veterans of Ia Drang, American and Vietnamese, carried the memories of fallen comrades for the rest of their lives. In the end, the cry of Broken Arrow at Ia Drang encapsulates the extremes of combat. Utter desperation meeting unwavering resolve. When trapped and outnumbered, Moore's battalion did the unthinkable. They called in fire on their own position, trusting in their training and each other to weather the storm. It was a gamble that could have killed them all, but it was the only choice left. And it worked. The enemy was kept at bay, and the battalion survived. The men who walked out of Ia Drang, bloodied, ears ringing, faces smeared with mud and exhaustion, would go down in history as embodiments of the soldier's creed: never quit, never accept defeat, and never leave a fallen comrade. The Battle of Ia Drang and the broken arrow that saved the 7th Cavalry remain a testament to the courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood forged in the crucible of combat. They endured the unendurable and emerged alive, and for those who fell in that valley, their story is now engraved in time. Ia Drang was their fight, and their valor under fire ensured that, even in the most desperate hour, they would not be forgotten.